also, it turns out that Suella Braverman has said that political correctness has actually failed us in this country. And what's happened is that Islamist terrorists have flourished. So I'm going to ask Gavin, who's based over in Paris, how the French deal with it. Gavin, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
Very well indeed, very well indeed. Once again, I'd have to say, a story in the Times this morning written by Fiona Hamilton, Crime and Security Editor, does not surprise me. Political correctness has created a blind spot in which Islamist extremists have operated under our radar. Well, knock me down with a feather, you know? Why is it that everything we say on this show turns out to be true?
Well, do you know what the French intelligence services dubbed London in the 1990s, Mike? No. Londonistan.
Really?
Because it was full of Islamic extremists. And in 1995, for example, there was a series of bombings on the Paris transport network.
Yeah.
And the main suspect fled to London, and it took the French 10 years to have him extradited. He was then convicted and he's now serving life imprisonment. But that's when the name began. And there's been a complacency at the heart of the British establishment, the government, the intelligence services, for a quarter of a century now when it comes to Islamic extremism, and it exasperates the French. And the French are so much more ahead, Mike, than the British when it comes to extremism. For example, 2013, the then Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, a socialist, said that the term Islamophobia, he doesn't recognise it, he rejects it because it's just a way of extremists to, if you like, put a sort of a cordon sanitaire around Islam to prevent any criticism of religion.
Yes, because in France, of course, and in Paris in particular, you've had the Charlie Hebdo incident, you've had the deadly Bataclan scenario where people were being gunned down the street. I mean, I remember thinking at the time, because, you know, I was on the tube quite a lot in those days, I remember thinking, imagine if that happened in London, if I walked around the corner of London Bridge Station onto a platform and suddenly 4 men were running at me with machine guns. I'm not sure what would happen. You know, it was a terrifying kind of time in history. So the French must now have a much better approach to dealing with that kind of thing. Because I remember looking at documentaries around that time, and many of those who came to shoot people from the Bataclan night, the concert there and in restaurants, they all came from a town in Belgium, I seem to remember, which was basically a place that had been taken over by Islamic extremists, and even the police in Belgium didn't go anywhere near it. So have they changed their attitude to all of that?
Yeah, that is Molenbeek, Mike.
That's
also
right, yeah.
Worth pointing out, by the way, that 2 of the Bataclan terrorists used the migrant route in 2015. Very interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, in a leading French current affairs magazine, a French-Iranian expert on Islamic terrorism warned that Islamic states are regrouping, and he named Paris, Berlin and London as their prime targets. They want to pull off a spectacular. So that threat has not diminished whatsoever. But going back to your question, Mike, you remember, I mean, I suppose in terms of emotional, psychological impact, probably arguably the most devastating Islamist attack was the beheading in broad daylight on a suburban Paris street of a school teacher, Samuel Paty, in October 2020. All he'd done is a class discussion about freedom of expression. He'd showed a caricature of Prophet Muhammad in a class, and for that he was brutally murdered. And afterwards, I thought Emmanuel Macron, I've criticised him a lot in the past, but I thought he really articulated the horror and the determination at the same time of the French. And he criticised Islam. He said that there was a war within the religion between the extremists and the moderates. He was quite right, of course. But of course, this caused outrage across the Muslim world, outrage fomented by extremist groups. But just last month, actually, Mike, Macron hosted a number of prominent Muslim figures at the Elysee to discuss a French Islam. What he wants to do is to rinse Islam in France of outside influence, particularly Algerian, Turkish, Saudi Arabian. And I think this is the way to go. And if you look at Britain, there's still far too much influence outside of the UK.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, you only have to look around the country today that we live in to see that this is absolutely right. I mean, I don't know if you saw that story up in Yorkshire where a boy who was said to be highly autistic has been suspended now, not expelled from a school, and the police saw fit to go to a mosque and make a statement that it wasn't necessarily a hate crime. I mean, do me a favour. People are getting so sick of it that there has to be some kind of a change of stance by the police soon.
Well, and that comes from the government. But Mike, when was it? It was 2017, after the Manchester and the London Bridge attacks. Yeah. The then Prime Minister, Theresa May, said that we have to, I quote, have difficult and embarrassing conversations about Islam in Britain. And those have not been forthcoming. And we have got now to the stage, and we've talked about this before, you and I, when the MP David Emmis was killed 2 years ago. Yeah. It's by an Islamic extremist. It took several weeks for Parliament to admit this. They tried to blame it on a toxic social media environment, and they just lacked the courage to confront this problem. So Suella Braverman is to be applauded. But of course, we've been here before with her predecessor, Priti Patel, talking tough about illegal immigrants. Nothing happened there. So it's vital that Ms. Braverman really follows through and creates a sea change in how we approach Islamic extremism.
Yes. Well, and all these kind of narratives that, you know, we must welcome everybody from every corner of the world who wishes to seek refuge in our country because we are a tolerant nation, you know, as very well illustrated by that ghastly individual who should have been deported to Jamaica, who was saved from being deported to Jamaica by the Labour Party and a whole bunch of celebrities who thought that it was wrong, and he's now murdered somebody else. So brilliant. Great job.
Yeah. And of course, that's very similar to the terrible story last month of Tom Roberts, the aspirant Royal Marine, who was murdered in Bournemouth by an Afghan who'd murdered 2 people in Serbia and had still been rejected by Norway, and yet still had been able to come to the UK, and he robbed a young man of his life. And we will see these stories time and again, Mike, and we see the same trite reaction from Parliament. All lessons must be learned, but lessons are never learned. And I'm sure that we're just going to be here in a year's time, wringing our hands at another terrible outrage. Yeah. But something has to be done, because the patience of the British people, it's wearing thin, frankly, and understandably, because it just seems a lack of will from our leaders to really get to grips with these problems.